Dear Professor Parry, welcome to St. Petersburg. And my first question would be, have you ever visited our country before? Or is it your first visit?
This is my first visit to Russia. I look forward to this visit for a long time, and I'm happy to be here.
And how do you like our city? Have you seen already something and have you such an opportunity?
Well, I've only been here a few days, but I certainly enjoy what I see. It's a beautiful city. It's a wonderful city for walking in. And of course, there are all of the historic sites and the beautiful buildings and the rich history of both Imperial Russia and Revolutionary Russia.
Speaking more about the philosophy, have you always studied Plato, and what is your particular sphere of interest, if not? What you are doing your report on?
That's right. Most of my academic career has been devoted to studying ancient philosophy, ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but the philosophy of Plato in particular. And if I focus, I've also written on Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher, and in general on ancient Greek moral philosophy. But when it comes to Plato, my focus is on Plato's moral philosophy, especially his what would I call it, philosophy of virtue. The Greek word is arete, which is an extremely important word in Greek, which the concept predates Plato. You find the idea in Homer and also in the poets. But Plato takes the idea of arete and changes it in very interesting ways, interesting for us and interesting in the ancient Greek culture.
Mm-hmm. And your particular report tomorrow will be on what kind of topics? So do you take some particular part of that moral philosophy or not?
I do. This is a very narrowly focused paper. I'm looking at a particular passage in Book 9 of Plato's Republic, in which Socrates puts forth the idea, well, the passage is an argument that the life of the philosopher is better than the life of the tyrant. And he presents several arguments for that idea. One of them is that the tyrant, or the figure of the tyrant, is frequently portrayed in Greek thought as a life given over to pleasure, and by what he means by pleasure is bodily pleasure. And the idea is that in the larger Greek philosophy, not in Plato's dialogue, that the life of the tyrant is more rewarding when it comes to pleasure. The life of the philosopher is not rewarding when it comes to pleasure. The philosopher's life is dull, without enough of the rewards of bodily pleasure. All right. So in my paper, what I do is I focus on Socrates' argument that the life of the philosopher is more pleasurable than the life of the tyrant. And the reason is, and this is what I focus on, and this is a very strange idea, the pleasures of the body are deceptive, that only the pleasures of the philosopher are real pleasures. So that's a fairly unusual and even bizarre idea to say that pleasures are deceptive. So I look into Socrates' arguments as to the idea that pleasures can be deceptive and try to figure out what he might have meant by that idea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yeah, that's probably what Stoics later took from Plato and Socrates' school, the very idea of the deceptive nature of pleasure. Yeah,
precisely, yes, right. And it's an odd thing to say because we think of pleasure as on the surface of it enjoyable. What's deceptive about it? But there's also this other dimension to it that we sometimes are disappointed in our pleasures. And when we are disappointed in the pleasures that we have had, that implies they have been deceptive in some way. They've misled us. So that's first, that's an idea I think that Plato first of all introduces and that subsequent philosophers have elaborated on. So it's an interesting, if strange, idea.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And if I may ask you about that, we as the scholars who study antiquity studies, we are usually questioned whether what is the value and importance of what we are doing. What do you think about that? What do you think, what is the use probably for the modern society is in studying such things?
One of my very favorite questions, thank you for asking it. I think there's a great deal of value to studying ancient Greek and Roman literature, history, and philosophy. Among other things, I don't know what the term in Russian is, but in English we refer to the humanities. And by that we mean the study of the various ways that historically human beings have conceived of living a human life and the values that leading that life enshrine. So we have many, so to speak, models of what it is to lead a human life from different eras in history. And one of the really interesting models is the ancient Greek and Roman model. Now, it's not the same as our today's model, but it is a very valuable source to see the ideals they held up for living a good human life, as well as the literature especially and the history records the way in which they failed to live up to their ideals, and that is instructive as well. So I think for contemporary living, being able to look at the Greek model, to see the ideals they held, to also reflect on how they failed to live up to those ideals, tells us something about our contemporary way of trying to live a human life. We can compare those two very fruitfully. It gives us insight into what our present problems are. And I find that when students learn about ancient Greek philosophy or literature or history, it lights up for them the problems they have even today.
And do you think that the academic society in your country thinks so? So they pay such attention to antiquity problems? I mean, the state, the government, and probably the very organization of the scholarship there. Does it think so? Does it pay enough attention to that?
Yeah, that also is a very, very interesting question. There's this phrase we have, there's good news and there's bad news. I'll start with the bad news first. The bad news is that the culture in general and the academic culture in particular, in my time as a teacher, which is, I was 50 years a professor, the academic culture has moved, unfortunately, from an appreciation of the value of studying ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Roman philosophy, or for that matter, just studying history and literature and philosophy of any era other than our own, has moved from that to an idea of education as having largely an instrumental value. I don't want to be unpleasant about this, but the rise of business programs and the rise of practically oriented university degrees seems to emphasize the idea that what students should learn is how to fit as cogs into a larger economic and financial structure, which will then reward them with all of the glittering, bright-colored cars, apartments, entertainment. And that educational policy and the rewards that follow from it seem to undermine the value of studying ancient Greek, Roman culture, or in fact any culture other than the contemporary culture. So that's the bad news. The good news is there are a lot of very talented, creative, mostly young people who are now working in the field of philosophy and literature and history, who have taken on the task of making the teaching of what we call the classics exciting, attractive, even entertaining, and they're doing a great job. They're attracting students to come back to the classics, to study and take seriously these ancient literatures and find value in them, in spite of the fact that the larger society doesn't actually reward them in the way that these other people get rewarded with the glittering prizes.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that only scholars are responsible for that, kind of reviving the interest to the antiquity studies? Or do you think that government should somehow support it, or any kind of higher establishment?
It's also incumbent upon especially the academic culture, to encourage them to actually have jobs for them to fill. Yes, it definitely is a responsibility of the educational establishment, and insofar as the state is responsible for maintaining the academy, the universities, it's important for them to realize the efforts that these young people are making. So it's still a contest that's going on. It hasn't, this is good, I think, it hasn't been decided yet. In the country that I come from, it hasn't been decided yet, and we can hope that there will at least be room for these other people who have this other idea of education, and that our educational system won't be emptied out so that all we have is, how shall I put this, MBAs, Master of Business Administration degrees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, because Plato always wanted to create some kind of philosophical state governed by philosophers, and with that beautiful idea of truth and justice ruling everything around him. Do you think that we still should try to achieve that goal, that great aim, or should we just be scholars and try to study and preserve something that we know? So should we introduce those things into our day-to-day life, into real life?
Yes. Insofar as the study of ancient thought has an impact on contemporary society, I think it's very important to bring some of the concerns of people like Plato and Aristotle forward to our own culture, especially one of my very favorite topics in Plato and in Aristotle, and for that matter in the Stoics and in the Epicureans, is the role of virtue in public life. Virtues are qualities of character or character traits. Some of them can be common, and that is widespread and positive, like generosity or kindness. If you are a generous person, you tend to be sharing. A generous person is someone, for instance, wants to share a meal with someone. They don't want to just have the meal for themselves. They want to share it. Then there are other character traits which are negative, but also common, like selfishness and egotism. And a selfish person doesn't want to share. A selfish person thinks only about himself, herself. Excuse me. Those are common, fairly well-known character traits. But then there are other more elevated character traits, the ones you mentioned, which have a very large impact on our moral life, namely justice and courage and moderation and wisdom, which were Plato's 4 favorites. And in fact, those 4 favorites can be found in other Greek philosophers. Those 4, sometimes referred to as cardinal virtues, are the subject of a lot of reflection on the part of philosophers. And in my opinion, we need nothing so much as, first of all, public figures who have these virtues. It's not so important what you get accomplished in this idea of virtue, but the kind of person you are. And so insofar as public policy has any impact on these issues, I think it should at least make room for the value of these high moral virtues, like wisdom and courage and moderation and justice.
Just summarizing our interview, can you wish something to your St. Petersburg colleagues, to colleagues of Russia, in terms of, I don't know, wish something?
Well, I don't know how university education is playing out here. But I wish to them, first of all, in the context of this conference, that they will become acquainted even more deeply with the philosophy of Plato in this particular case, but other ancients, and that they will imbibe the joys of studying these great minds from the past.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.